So thank you very much for joining today for this presentation. Again, my name is Sara Stahlman. I am the Extension Director for Pennsylvania Sea Grants. I want to give a huge thanks to Nick for setting this up and arranging for me to speak today to you and give this training. Just some introduction. I'm giving this webinar today to introduce you to and familiarize you with the rapid response process in Pennsylvania. So I'm going to be going through our rapid response plan, and so hopefully by the end you would understand what the plan is, what it's used for, and what your potential role might be in the rapid response process. And just so that you know that there is a stepwise process that you can follow if you're out in the field and you see something that you think should be reported or shouldn't be there. So just start out with what the plan is. This is an image of the most recent and up-to-date rapid response plan. It is still in the process of going through review. We just recently updated it. So if you follow that seagrant.psu.edu address and try to access it, you will still see the old version. But that will change very soon. We're in the process of getting that updated, ready to go. Basically, the purpose of this plan is to provide guidance or a framework of the steps to follow after receiving a report of a potential invasive species. So it serves several different functions. The first one is defining when a response is going to be appropriate to a potential invasive species, who's going to be in charge, what partners should be involved, and then what types of responses should be considered for that particular infestation. A little bit of background on the development of the rapid response plan. This started way back in 2008. This is actually one of the first projects that I started working on when I began at Pennsylvania Sea Grants. So kind of in the beginning, it was more of just looking at what other states were doing and trying to come up with some concepts that could potentially work in Pennsylvania. So a year later, we took those concepts and we held a rapid response workshop in Bellefonte for state agency staff to try to get their input and feedback into some kind of a working draft. Then from there, between 2010 and 2013, we actually used several real-life invasive species incidents as field tests for the plan. So, for example, when round gobies were found in the gravel pit ponds in Erie County, we pulled together a phone call, ran through the plan, did the same thing with New Zealand mud snails when they showed up in Spring Creek, Didymo and the Youghiogheny. But these introductions helped us to realize that going through the plan in real-life scenarios, there were a lot of gaps and questions that we still needed to address. That ultimately led us to revamping the plan in 2013 to a three-tiered structure, which I'm going to go through with you today. And we were officially approved by the Pennsylvania Invasive Species Council, that we call PISC, in 2014. So basically since then, we've held two additional exercises, one in 2015, that was a mock rapid response exercise to starry stonewort in Presque Isle Bay. And then we held another one just this past November in 2017 that focused on hydrilla. Again, these are mock exercises. There is an infestation of starry stonewort in Presque Isle Bay, but there was not an infestation of hydrilla in Presque Isle Bay. I'm actually going to be using that mock exercise and some of the examples from it as we go through this presentation. So first, let's take a look at what the plan looks like. Like I said, it is in a three-tiered structure. So Tier 1, or Section 1, this is basically an overall big picture view of what a rapid response is going to look like in Pennsylvania. So it takes the form of a decision tree. This is not meant to be used as a standalone document to get through a rapid response, but its purpose is, again, to show the big picture, and it's intended to accompany the narrative portion of the rapid response plan. The cool thing about this section is that it can be used as a quick reference. So if you're going through a rapid response and you want more information on something, there's actually links in each of these bubbles for each of the action steps that will take you to the part of the plan that has more information. So instead of cycling through pages and pages of the plan, you can use this as an active link within the web document. Section 2 is a checklist list of actions that actually can be used as a standalone document. So some of the feedback that we got from folks that were going through the rapid response plan was that there was just too much, and it was hard to get to what they needed to get to. So this expands just enough on each of the action steps that you'd be able to complete the response, especially if you're very familiar with going through the response. However, if there's part of it that you have questions about or that stumps you, you can then go on to section 3, which is where you're going to find your very detailed, comprehensive information about each of the action steps that might be needed to assist you as you're going through the response. So in addition to just very in-depth information about each of the steps, you're also going to find contact information in this section. So for your federal and state agencies and partners and people who might need to be included in the rapid response effort, that's where you're going to find it. This section also has some interactive tools in it. So as you're going through a response, this will help you make decisions. It'll help you look at different response options, and it will help you plan your rapid response. So we'll go through those in just a little bit. First, I wanted to give you some background on the mock exercise that we did that I'm going to be referencing throughout this presentation. So resource managers and biologists from federal and state agencies and organizations throughout Pennsylvania. We even had some representatives from New York that came. We gathered in Erie on November 16th and participated in a mock rapid response exercise. Again, this is designed to just familiarize resource managers with the fundamentals of the rapid response process, which is very similar to what we're doing today. But this is a lot more intensive. It's a day-long, hands-on exercise. This is definitely an hour-long abridged version of that. And that exercise was centered around a mock scenario where hydrilla was introduced into the Lake Erie watershed, and more specifically Presque Isle State Park. So if you're not familiar, that is shown on the map. And participants were asked to respond to this scenario as though the infestation had actually occurred, and they used the plan to get through each step and to actually develop an action plan to address the hydrilla. So here's what the scenario looked like. We had a park volunteer that found a patch of unknown plant near a boat launch in Presque Isle Bay. They used the Pennsylvania Invasive Species Field Guide to determine that it could possibly be hydrilla. And I'm just going to give a side note here. All of you on the call should have a copy of the field guide that I'm referencing, and if you do not, at the end of the presentation, let me know or let Nick know, and I can get those sent to you. That's a vital part in the early detection and rapid response process, is being able to identify things out in the field, and we do have those to give away. So continuing on, the volunteer took some pictures and reported what he had found to one of the park managers at the Tom Ridge Environmental Center. The park manager went back to verify the infestation and found 2 additional sites where the plant was found. So in total, there were 3 sites. One was near a marina, one was right in near the channel to the launch, and one was 520 feet outside the channel into the bay where DCNR no longer had jurisdiction. So that kind of threw a wrench into things and brought up some discussion about who would be in charge when it's outside of DCNR's jurisdiction. So the question became, as we moved forward with the exercise, what would it look like if Pennsylvania was a leader in aquatic invasive species rapid response? How would it go? What would it look like? And does our current plan reflect these visions for response? And if not, how can we improve or enhance it? So I kind of want you guys to keep that same question in your mind as we move forward. If you see something that you think could be improved, or it doesn't make sense to you or wouldn't work for you, we definitely want to know about it. And as Nick said, there's going to be a chance for some feedback at the end. All right, so let's get into the actual response part of the presentation. There are 7 action steps. I'm going to go through each one. This is action 1, which is your very first step. First thing you're going to do is, if you find something strange or you actually receive a report from somebody else, you need to report that suspected species to our Invasive Species Council coordinator. So that answers the question, who's the first point of contact here? And the goal of this action item is to take reports that might be coming in from a wide variety of sources. A lot of the times, your general public or other boots on the ground people are going to be the first ones who are going to be seeing the report, and they may not always report it to where it needs to go. They're going to go to the agency or the organization that is most familiar to them, but not necessarily the person that has the regulatory authority. So kind of the point of this is to provide one central entity as the point of contact that can then filter out all the reports and identify the appropriate agency contact that will actually begin the rapid response. That'll avoid all confusion on, who should be contacted, who has jurisdiction. It will go to the council coordinator, and that person will make those decisions. So in the case of the mock exercise, the volunteer is the one who discovers the infestation and then alerts one of the park managers. So it's now up to that park manager to determine who the report should be submitted to, and that should be the council coordinator. So if you are the one submitting a report to the coordinator, if somebody comes to you with something, these are just some things that you make sure you want to include when you're submitting a report. Obviously, your name and contact information, the date of the observation, driving directions to the nearest access point in case you need to go back and verify, and clear close-up digital photographs. And we'll go into that a little bit more later. Once you submit the report, the council coordinator is going to review that. And if they recognize right away that what you're submitting is not the appropriate species, so if they see right away, okay, that's not hydrilla, they would then send a notification back to you thanking you for taking the time to look and report, but they wouldn't go any further with it. If they feel the photo could be hydrilla, then they would submit the report to the appropriate agency. So just to talk about a couple challenges as I'm talking about reporting this to the council coordinator, a huge gap and challenge in this very first step is that we currently do not have a council coordinator. The good news is that PISC said that they will be hiring a council coordinator hopefully in February or March, so that position will be filled. However, that left a gap in the plan for as long as we didn't have one. So that's something we've been kind of working on, making sure that it doesn't render the plan useless. So we are working on developing some general reporting mechanisms, such as an invasive species reporting hotline, an email, and then there's also web reporting forms that you can use, and I've listed there's actually multiples of them, and there's a seagrant reporting form. If you go to our website, right on the very front homepage, you can report invasive species from there. Fish and Boat Commission has a reporting form, and you can also use the reporting function in IMAP Invasive. So we're encouraging folks to use those online reporting forms in the meantime while there is no council coordinator and there is no hotline or email address. So we are working on developing that. That's kind of our first priority at the moment to make sure that the plan can be used properly. So action 2 is the report high priority. This step is going to help us determine if action is actually needed. We all know that we have very limited staff time and funding and resources, so action should only be taken if the report coming in is deemed credible and high priority. Now, this is going to be determined by the agency that has been contacted and has regulatory authority over the species in question. So this step is basically going to include a preliminary investigation, but it's mostly using best professional knowledge and judgment to determine if action is needed. So in some cases, the report is going to be labeled low priority. And some of the reasons for that I have listed. One, if we know that the species is already well known or established in an area, for example, Prescott State Park is heavily infested with the invasive plant Phragmites. So if we get a report coming in for frag, it's not going to be given high priority because we already know about it, they're already treating it. It's not going to elicit a brand new response. Also, if the species we know is not going to be able to survive Pennsylvania's climate. So in this case, the species is run through a climate match, and it's determined that the climate is not suitable for species establishment. And the last one, and this is just an example, for that location, there's already an existing report of a species that's deemed higher risk and where our limited resources should be allocated first. So this isn't to say that the report isn't important, but there's something else that's there that we need to take care of first. So we might need to set this one aside and come back to it later. So here's an example. I listed climate matching as one of the ways to determine if it will be a priority. This is a climate matching tool called RAMP that was put out by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and this can help determine if a species is going to be high priority based on climate conditions and whether that species is actually able to establish or not. So basically what this software does is it looks at a species, it looks at that species' native range or where that species is already established. It takes the weather data from those locations and then compares it with weather data from a particular target region of interest, which for us might be areas of Pennsylvania. So this is what it looks like for hydrilla. It's scored on a scale from 0 to 10, which it might be difficult to see down here. But 8 through 10 are kind of in your orangey red regions, and that signifies a high climate match. So that tells us that if hydrilla were to be introduced, there's a pretty good chance that it will establish, and we might want to consider that a priority. So if a report is labeled low priority, it doesn't mean that those reports should disappear. Instead, they should be reported internally, they should be reported to other agencies or partner organizations, and definitely to mapping and tracking initiatives. Some examples are IMAP Invasives or EDMAP or the USGS Non-Indigenous Aquatic Species Database, because it's very important to know where things are showing up and being able to track that distribution. So definitely don't just let that report sit because it's considered low priority. So action 3 is to identify and verify the species. So if it has been determined that the species is a high threat or priority, then that agency with jurisdictional authority is going to then facilitate positively verifying the identity of the species to make sure that you're moving forward with what you think you're moving forward with. So newly reported invasives have to be verified by an expert who's recognized by the agency. In some cases, there's experts on staff, so you can just use them in-house, but other times you might need to consult with an outside source. And in some cases, you're also going to have to go back into the field to collect a sample or take more pictures or collect additional information. So make sure that if you are the one doing that and you are collecting a specimen, that you keep that specimen contained to avoid possible spread of the invasive species or any other organisms that could possibly be attached to it. So make sure you take the necessary protocols for that. And it's also important to note that some species it is illegal to possess or transport in Pennsylvania, which is the case for hydrilla. It's listed as a federal noxious weed. So you have to make sure that when you're going out, you're aware of what the rules are on the species that you're interested in. So this is just a sample list. The Rapid Response Plan provides a list of experts that you can consult if you do not have one on staff or you do not know how to positively identify the species. This is just a sample of them, but there's a whole list in the Rapid Response Plan for you to look at. And then here are just a few tools that we recommend taking with you in the field to document the find so that you can get as much detail as possible, which is obviously going to help with the identification process and being able to find the location again for follow-up. So a few things you want to take note of when you're out in the field or you're in that info gathering step. Definitely record your latitude and longitude, again, driving directions so you can get to the nearest access point, and definitely notes about location, habitat, environmental conditions, size of the infestation, if there's other species present, pretty much anything that you think would be useful, and as much information as possible is going to be helpful moving forward with additional steps in the process. Taking photographs is extremely important, especially if you're unable to collect a specimen, like with the hydrilla example. So that's what we're going to be going off of to make a positive ID. So I put in just a few tips to make sure that you're taking the best photographs that can be used for identification. You want to make sure that you're taking very clear and up-close digital pictures, and you take many pictures from many different angles. It's always good, if you can, to include a reference object, like a coin's a good one, to help establish a scale when you're looking at the picture. Including photos of the immediate surroundings, providing good background contrast. Like if you're taking a picture of hydrilla, don't take a picture with a green grassy background where you can't distinguish the plant from the background. And make sure to get good pictures of any distinguishing characteristics that might be helpful for ID. So for hydrilla, if you can take an up-close picture of the whorls, they have serrated edges on the leaves, and that can be a distinguishing characteristic. So if you can get that close, that's a good thing to do. In the plan, we also have an appendix that can help guide through collecting specimens. We're currently in the process of updating this section as well, because we did find out during the mock exercise that there were a few discrepancies in how Fish and Boat Commission was recommending collection and how we had them listed. So right now we're working with Fish and Boat to update these collection protocols and make sure that they're accurate and consistent. So that appendix can be a reference source for your use in the future when we have the new version out in public. This is going to come up quite a bit, but communication is key in making sure not to forget key partners, especially in this step. If species identification is verified, we definitely want to make contact as soon as possible with key partners, stakeholders, and the other appropriate entities. For example, if the reported invasive species was verified on federal lands or in areas that impact federal resources, you might want to consider contacting your federal partners and making sure that you don't forget about them. This is also a good step to issue press releases. The more people that are aware that there's a new species, the more you can prevent further spread and potentially leverage resources from your partners as well. So at this point in the process, it's good to issue that press release. Even if an actual rapid response action is not going to happen, that awareness is extremely important. So action 4 is conducting a risk assessment. Just because we have positively identified a species doesn't necessarily mean it's always appropriate to take action. We need to assess that first and assess the potential threat that the introduced species poses. It's important to note that at this stage, it's not always necessary to have all the nitty-gritty details about the infestation. Like, you might not know what the density of the population is or what the extent of the infestation is or things like that right now, because we haven't gotten there yet. It's more important at this point to focus on what the potential threats are. If you're not sure what a risk assessment is, this is basically a systematic process that's used to evaluate the potential risks that could be involved in a particular activity. So in our example from the mock exercise, we were looking at it would be the introduction and spread of hydrilla and wanting to know, is the risk of introduction and spread of hydrilla in the Lake Erie watershed a low, medium, or a high risk? So that's the question we're asking, and we're using a risk assessment process to answer that. So in Pennsylvania, our risk assessment process is pretty simple. It's just 3 steps, 3 questions that we ask. So step 1 is going to be, is this a new invasion? Step 2 is going to be, if a population already exists, is it increasing? And 3 is the species known to cause significant impact? So if we're going through this example with hydrilla and our mock exercise example, our very first step is this a new invasion? The answer to that is yes. So we would skip 2 and go right to step 3 and ask, is the species known to cause significant impact? We do know that hydrilla causes many significant impacts in many places where it's been introduced, including Pymatuming, which is nearby. And so we would say yes, and we would designate the species as a high risk, and therefore we would consider moving forward with the rapid response. So once we've determined that our species is high risk, the next step in the process is going to be twofold. So first, in order to determine appropriate response options, we have to have that information now. We got to back up what the response options would be. So this is the point in the process where you want to take that time and effort to gather as much information as possible at the infestation level. So this is done by conducting a site-specific assessment. The information gathered during this step will help determine if a rapid response is feasible, if it's necessary, and it'll also help determine any potential environmental, economic, or human health threats associated with this particular occurrence. So here's the type of information you may want to try to gather at this step, but it is important to note that you may not be able to get all of this information, and because of the urgency involved in a rapid response, it will sometimes be necessary to evaluate your options without having optimal information being available. So if you can gather information on things like the extent and abundance of the invading species, origin of the species, evidence of any reproduction that's taking place, what type of substrate's present, ecosystem type, are there other species present, and is that particular site being used for any recreational or economic uses. So this is just a sample of the site assessment considerations we looked at for hydrilla. So we wanted to know what portion of the water body in Presque Isle Bay could be colonized, basically looking at water depths of less than 30 feet. What was the substrate like, and what was the potential for forming dense beds of hydrilla? What's the potential for rapid spread? What vectors might be involved in spreading hydrilla around to other locations? What resources and uses are threatened? Presque Isle Bay is used a lot for fishing and boating and other types of recreational activities. Is there a potential for eradication, and is law enforcement action or any other form of investigation needed? So in the rapid response exercise, participants sat and discussed and pulled together as much information as they possibly could. That was the first step of Action 5, is just pulling together that info. The second part is to then take that information and evaluate what your possible response options could be. Now, before you can actually determine response options, you need to understand what your goals and objectives are so that you can decide what's the best way to achieve those goals and objectives. Now, we know eradication is always going to be our primary goal, but we have to remember that that's not always possible. So we have to be realistic about what goals are the most attainable and also what are the most cost-effective. What's going to be the best bang for our buck. Some examples of possible objectives and goals are containing the problem entirely to a given area, just suppressing the population and slowing its spread and preventing it from spreading to new locations, and also things like maintaining economic value of a resource. These are just a few examples. That could be any number of given goals based on the particular infestation. So once you do have your goals set out and have them in mind, you can then begin to think about what are the possible response options that you might consider to meet those goals or objectives. So possible response options that you could think about are things like chemical controls, mechanical, biological controls, using law enforcement action, education and outreach, monitoring the population, pretty much anything else that you could think of that would help you meet those goals. So the Rapid Response Plan offers a tool to help you with all that objective development and goal brainstorming. This is the response options template, and the purpose of this is to give you kind of a side-by-side comparison of all of the possible response options that you could come up with to meet your goals. So you would kind of write in each of your response options, and then this template would help you to consider things like what resources are available versus what's needed. Are there any laws or regulations to consider? What permits would you need? What available funding is there to pay for the response? So, you know, is it something that you can fund, or will you need to search for outside funding? So this is essentially a decision-making tool to help you decide, based on comparison, what's going to be your best option. So a few other questions to consider when you're thinking about those types of responses is to think about any potential economic, political, social, or ecological impacts of the chosen method. What's the availability and feasibility of the chosen method? Has it been used before on this species or a similar species, and what has that looked like? What's your potential for success, and then what is your timetable? So again, we're going to kind of go back to talking about communication and sharing your decisions with the public and partners. Public awareness at this step is extremely important for many reasons, but especially to have them on board with you for the response and staying in front of any misinformation or rumors that could start to develop, and that can be accomplished in a lot of different ways. You can use things like press releases, media campaigns, various educational materials, social media, and even face-to-face interactions. No matter how you choose to do it, just making sure that you have your partners involved that can, again, help you to leverage resources, and having the public on board and having that general awareness will be very helpful moving forward. Okay. And so after completing this step, during the mock exercise, a few of the objectives and responses for this particular infestation were for hydrilla to minimize or eradicate existing populations and stop the spread in Presque Isle Bay, to maintain visitor and economic values of the park, to educate recreational water users and visitors to the park, and to further evaluate and monitor existing patches. So those are what our participants came up with for their objectives. And then here's what they came up with for possible actions for hydrilla. And these were different breakout sessions that happened, so not necessarily doing all of these, but these are just some considerations that they came up with. Things like monitoring the range and spread, developing that educational material like signage, or using programs like boat stewards positioned at entrance and exit sites, using herbicide treatments in combination with benthic barriers, suction harvesting, dredging during the winter to avoid plant fragmentation, possibly restricting access to certain areas of the bay to minimize boat traffic and minimize risk of spread, and then also coordinating with federal and state partners and anyone else who has work potentially planned in the bay to make sure that they're aware of the situation and they don't continue to spread hydrilla. So if a decision is made to respond, the next step is to create an incident response plan. So the incident response framework is another tool that's in the rapid response plan, and this is what you're going to use to outline what the response, how the response will happen, and who's going to take the lead. So overall, what it's going to look like. This form kind of helps ensure that all involved entities are working together, and that everyone that should be at the table is at the table. And while this plan is intended for use by the agency with regulatory authority, other agencies and organizations will play a role in the response, and implementing actions should be considered here too. So it's not always the agency that's going to be taking action, and you can include your partners and other stakeholders. Back to communication. When a response action is being planned, it's important to identify and contact those other agencies, organizations, commercial entities, and neighboring states who have a vested interest in the process. So timely information and a coordinated message should be dispensed to stakeholders and others that are listed here. And partnerships with these groups can help develop those on-the-ground campaigns against the invader, which can include carrying out the developed action plan, potentially helping you to monitor your results, and conducting that education and outreach. So we've actually made it to the last action step, which is to evaluate our results and conduct further next steps. So this is extremely important. This is our post-incident evaluation. So this is going to help us determine how successful the response was and what we might need to change for the next time around. So were the response objectives met? Did it run like a well-oiled machine, or were there parts of the plan that didn't run with ease? What were your sticking points? How were they overcome? How do we fix this before the next time? So this is going to kind of shape and mold how you perform rapid response actions into the future. So So in addition to direct actions, education and outreach plays a key role in the implementation process. So ensuring that stakeholders and public entities are informed and engaged, again, is important for that buy-in process, help with proposed actions, and encouraging added caution when working in areas that might be affected or participating in activities that could spread species or further exacerbate the issues. So this is something that Pennsylvania Sea Grant, my organization, is really good at, the education and outreach component. So if there is an infestation, we can help provide resources like fact sheets and those field guides, and we have stickers and giveaways and things that can engage the public. So making sure to reach out to partners like Sea Grant to help you move forward. Depending on the treatment that you choose, it might be appropriate to develop restoration projects. This information can be taken from the information gathering step of the process, as well as feedback from the surveillance and monitoring. And so you'll determine whether that's necessary or needed at that time. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on that. So this is just kind of at the end, after we went through all of these steps during the mock exercise. We kind of had some final discussion and questions, and some things that we talked about were how we can make this plan more usable to non-agency folks. A lot of the times, lake associations or conservation districts or other environmental organizations end up taking the lead on some of these things. So that was one of the things that we talked about in trying to make it more user-friendly for everyone. And then also if this is something that we can use to eventually develop species-specific action plans so that agencies can just take, we have an infestation of hydrilla, we have this hydrilla-specific plan that's available, you can take it and run with it. And then, again, following back with that question of does this plan help bring us to our vision of becoming a leader in rapid response in Pennsylvania. So hopefully this presentation has introduced you to the plan, you're familiar with it, you know it exists, and hopefully if you're in that situation, it's something that you will use. Again, it is on the Pennsylvania Sea Grant website. You can access it there. The updated version will be up very soon. And I think with that, I can take any questions if there are any.